Okay. Good evening. We're about to start, and so I encourage you to find a seat as close to the front as you're comfortable with. It's nice to have this kind of an event where we're going to have questions and conversations for you to be closer to us. Well, a warm welcome to you all. We're glad it's not as warm as it was 3 hours ago. I apologize that the HVAC in the church is broken. But welcome to those of you who are in the church, and of course to those of you who are online. It's so encouraging to see this shared interest in trying to think differently and find ways forward in this time of increasing divisions that lead to the violence and war that we're all so concerned about. My name is Anne Jervis, and I'm one of the priests in this congregation, and I'm also a member of our church's adult education team. One of the chairs of that team, David Townsend, will be leading the question period after Jon Allen's talk. And speaking of the question period, you will have received a piece of paper and a pencil, and that's for the purpose of writing down any questions that may come to you during the course of Jon Allen's talk. Immediately after his talk, we'll collect those questions, and they will be collated, and then David Townsend will articulate them, as many as he can get through, on your behalf for Jon. Unfortunately, those of you joining us on YouTube, we will not be able to take your questions from the chat. We just haven't figured out how to do that in an expeditious way. I want to point out that there are 2 gender-neutral washrooms at the front of the church, and in case of an emergency, there is the front door, obviously, and a door on this side of the church and that side of the church. Again, we're just so pleased to be hosting this event with our distinguished speaker, and we do so in the anticipation and the expectation that it will all be done with respect. We ask you to hold your applause until the end of the evening, and of course to silence your cell phones now, please. It's my great privilege to introduce Mr. Jon Allen. Born in Winnipeg in 1950, Jon Allen obtained an LLB from the University of Western Ontario and an LLM in International Law from the London School of Economics. He joined the then Department of External Affairs in 1981. From 2006 to 2010, he was Canada's ambassador to Israel, and from 2012 to 2016, he was ambassador to Spain. Mr. Allen is currently a senior fellow at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto, a distinguished fellow of the Canadian International Council, and the chair of Rosanna Canada, a not-for-profit whose objective is to build bridges between Palestinians and Israelis via the health sector. Mr. Allen, we are so honored that you're with us tonight, and we very much look forward to your comments.
Thanks very much, Anne. Thank you, David. Thank you for all of the organizers for putting this together. Hello to all of you online. It's a difficult time for Jews and non-Jews, for Palestinians, for Muslims, and my talk will be an attempt to try and explain how we got to where we are in terms of October 7 and the war that followed, and then to talk a little bit about why I still have hope for the region, and some of the things that you might do if you're feeling some despair to try and bring your communities and yourselves some peace. In 1989, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the political scientist Francis Fukuyama pronounced the end of history, i.e., that liberal democracy had triumphed over communism and peace was upon us all. He soon came to regret his prediction. In September of 2023, Jake Sullivan, who is Joe Biden's national security advisor, was quoted as saying, "The Middle East is quieter now than it has been in decades." Now, to be fair to Jake, he was talking about Iraq and about Yemen and about Iran at the time. But what a horrifying difference a couple of months can make. Before I begin talking about the conflict and how it's impacted the region and our communities here, I wanted to be transparent with you. I'm Jewish. My wife is the child of Holocaust survivors. I have a sister, a niece, and nephews who live on a kibbutz in Israel, not far from the Lebanese border, and Hezbollah rockets that are falling close by on a daily basis. Second, I have been opposed to the Israeli settlement project, to the occupation, and to Israel's treatment of Palestinians in Gaza and in the West Bank since long before I became an ambassador to Israel. I continue to believe in and advocate for a two-state solution as the only means of ending the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. And I'll come back to this later. Let me also say that I'm very cognizant of the fact that I don't live in the region. I don't live under occupation or in a war zone, and I don't send my sons and my daughters to the army for 2 and 3 years to defend my country. Also, my wife and I have been emotionally torn since shortly after October 7, as we hold in our hearts feelings of sympathy and pain for the many thousands of dead and injured innocent Palestinians on the one hand, and for the families of the dead and injured Israelis and hostages still being held on the other. Understanding and dissecting this war and its antecedents may be complicated, but recognizing the death and the destruction that it has produced on both sides should not be. I'm also distressed, as no doubt many of you are, by the hate, the extremism, the rampant anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and anti-Palestinian racism that have been generated by so many people, including young college-educated people, many of whom who don't seem to understand or want to understand that this is a complex and long-standing conflict and that there is plenty of blame to lay on both sides. But before talking about October 7 and why I believe there is so much polarization and misunderstanding related to the current conflict, it's important to briefly talk about how Israel and Hamas and the Palestinians more generally got to where we are today. The Israeli election in November 2022 turned that country from a complicated and imperfect but functioning democracy into a polarized nation that was showing signs of falling apart at the seams.
It's worth briefly looking at the results of that election because of some of the policies and the actions and the personalities of the government that was elected then contributed directly or indirectly to October 7 attacks and the war that we have been witnessing for almost 9 months. Some of those actors continue to polarize Israel, advocate for a continuation of the war, and ignite violence in the West Bank. I'll then turn to October 7 and the response to it. I'll try to explain why so many Israelis, conservative Jews in the diaspora, and others continue to seek the total elimination of Hamas and the destruction of its infrastructure, and why the wider world has turned against Israel and largely forgotten about October 7. And finally, as I said, I'll conclude by offering you some hope, by explaining why and others believe that the two states for two peoples solution remains the only solution going forward. Prior to the October 7 attacks, Israel was already in crisis. The country had just experienced 39 weeks of massive protests against its far right-wing government. For the first time in the country's history, Army reservists were refusing to serve. Sitting judges were on the streets in their robes protesting, and Israelis from the right and the left, high-tech CEOs and workers were all demanding an end to the government's proposals on judicial reform and religious reform. In the West Bank, illegal settlements were expanding faster than ever before. Settler violence against Palestinians was rampant. Over 100 Palestinians had been killed by a combination of the IDF and settlers prior to October 7, while 30 Israelis were murdered in various incidents in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and in parts of the West Bank. Ironically, though, it was eerily quiet in the Gaza Strip, where the Netanyahu government had convinced itself that by granting permits to some 20,000 Gazans and by allowing Qatar to deliver tens of millions of dollars a month to Hamas, that the Gaza Strip and Hamas were under control. So what prompted this crisis in Israel? First of all, in that election, Israelis elected a government that was distinct from any they had ever had. It included, of course, Bibi Netanyahu's right-wing Likud party and several others that hoped to use their majority in Israel's parliament to pursue a radical, right-wing, nationalist, and religious agenda. Bibi's goal, then and now, was the same as it has been for 4 years and 5 elections, to guarantee himself a get-out-of-jail card. As you know, Bibi is under indictment for 3 offenses currently in Israel. His coalition partners hope to remove the major obstacle to their religious and expansionist intentions, the power of Israel's Supreme Court. Those coalition partners of Bibi included a man named Itamar Ben-Gvir, who is the Minister of National Security, who had a criminal record, convictions for racism and terrorism. He has called repeatedly for the expulsion of Arab citizens of Israel. Another, Bezalel Smotrich, the Minister of Finance with responsibilities for the West Bank, is the leader of a far-right religious Zionist party that advocates for full Israeli sovereignty in the West Bank. The protesters also opposed these various judicial reforms that the coalition was trying to bulldoze through the parliament. These included political control over appointments of Israeli court judges and a parliamentary override of Supreme Court decisions. These would have left Israel as a tyranny of the majority. Had they passed with a one-seat majority vote, there would have been no other institution in the country able to protect the rights of the LGBT community, of Arab Israelis, of refugees, of workers, or frankly, of any other minority group. Why? Because Israel has no constitution, no charter of rights, and no bicameral legislature, no sober second chamber to review and oppose legislation. Some of the most extreme measures that this coalition was trying to bring through were aimed directly at the Arab-Israeli sector. The Arab-Israeli sector in Israel constitutes 20% of the population. The proposed measures included deporting Arab Israelis if convicted of the ill-defined crime of disloyalty, and imposing the death penalty on those convicted of terrorism. Others sought to continue the exemption from serving in the military for ultra-Orthodox men who study the Torah full-time, and then to subsidize their incomes. We can talk about that in the Q&A if you want, because the Supreme Court has just decided that those ultra-Orthodox men will have to be drafted and serve in the army. So let me now turn to the events which began on October 7 and continue until today. The massacre by Hamas terrorists on October 7 resulted in the largest number of Jewish civilians killed in one day since the Holocaust. The murder of babies and the elderly, the dismemberment of women, and the abduction of some 240 hostages. I highlight this not only because it was a horrific attack, and not because Israeli blood is any different than Palestinian blood, and we'll come to the war in a few minutes, but rather because what happened on October 7 and the fact that almost every Israeli knows someone who was affected is key to understanding the almost universal Israeli support for a decisive and no-holds-barred response that exists even today, 9 months later. And it's in part why seemingly rational arguments for a more cautious, strategic, and targeted approach that was suggested by the Biden administration, including military experts with experience fighting ISIS and Al-Qaeda, why those were rejected by the Israelis, and why folks that I considered true peaceniks in Israel, at least initially, took a surprisingly very hard line regarding the attack and its consequences. October 7 has been compared by the media to 9/11. There are, of course, some similarities, but it was also different. It was the first non-rocket attack on Israeli soil. It represented so massive an intelligence and military failure that it has shaken Israelis to the core, broken their contract with the state, the military, their intelligence services, and made them question whether they can ever again be secure in the region, in their country, and in their homes. The response was a generalized combination of fear, humiliation, and a desire for revenge. One of the key Israeli war objectives, to eliminate the Hamas from Gaza, also raises comparisons with the failed U.S. efforts in Vietnam, in Iraq, and in Afghanistan. The difference, however, is that those wars didn't take place on American soil. Israelis will tell you that they have nowhere else to go. For them, what took place on October 7 was existential. And while I and others like Tom Friedman and Fareed Zakaria question whether this attack really was a threat to Israel's existence, it's kind of irrelevant because that's exactly how Israelis perceive it. That said, many experts, and they now include the Israeli Chief of Staff and the Minister of Defense, acknowledge the total elimination of Hamas, either as a political or a military force, or as an ideology, is simply not possible. Suffice it to say, though, Hamas's attack was extremely well planned. 2,200 terrorists entered southern Israel, killing 1,200, wounding 3,300, taking 240 hostages, and firing 3,000 rockets into Israel in one day. In fact, the relative ease and success of the mission seems to have gone beyond Hamas's wildest dreams. So why did it happen? How did it happen? I'm going to talk about the proximate causes here. I'm not going to talk about the occupation right now. We'll come back to that. I'm not going to talk about 57 years of settlements, etc. But first of all, let's recall that Hamas has controlled Gaza with an iron fist since 2007. Its original charter calls for the destruction of Israel, the elimination of Jews from the Mediterranean to the Jordan. Indeed, a senior Hamas leader told the New York Times 3 weeks after the attack that, quote, Israel can expect a second, a third, and a fourth attack until it is eliminated from the map. We must annihilate the country. Second, those right-wing Israeli ministers that I mentioned had been praying on the grounds of the Al-Aqsa Mosque in East Jerusalem, the third most holy Muslim site worldwide. Hamas has always projected itself as the primary defender of the Muslim faith in the region, and therefore saw an opportunity to demonstrate this on October 7. In fact, they mentioned that afterwards. Another key factor was that the Israeli Defense Forces and Israel's intelligence agencies had taken their eyes off of Gaza, and Hamas knew it. A number of military units were shifted to the West Bank to quell violence that was provoked by the government's policies of settlement expansion, settler violence, and threats of annexation. Indeed, southern Israel along the Gaza border was woefully unprepared and far too reliant on technical solutions for defense. Finally, there was the Israel-USA-Saudi agreement that was being negotiated just prior to the attack. This was an agreement that would have targeted ultimately Iran, Hezbollah, and Hamas. And as with the Abraham Accords before it, accords that were signed between Israel and the UAE, Morocco, Bahrain, there was no guarantee in this agreement that was being negotiated that the Palestinians were going to get anything out of it. No promises of statehood, no promises of negotiation going forward. In fact, Bibi Netanyahu appeared before the UN General Assembly in September of 2023 and held up a map depicting an Israel that stretched from the Mediterranean to the Jordan River. Sound familiar? And he frequently claimed publicly that Israel was able to gain recognition from Arab states without addressing Palestinian demands for a state of its own. It's therefore not surprising that since October 7, Hamas leaders have boasted that their actions have put the Palestinian issue back on the front pages and onto the international agenda. So where are we now? After almost 9 months of war and months of bombing and leveling more than half of the buildings of Gaza, including universities, hospitals, schools, and apartment buildings, the IDF is focusing its attention on Rafah in the south, very close to the Egyptian border. The IDF believes that Hamas's military and political leaders and the remaining hostages are located there, deep in the complex tunnel system that Hamas has been building for decades. As you're also likely aware, the vast majority of Gazans from the north and central parts of Gaza are now sheltering in and around Rafah, having been told previously by the IDF to move there. To date, over 37,000 Palestinians are believed to have been killed and 77,000 injured, including a very significant percentage of women and children. Israel claims that 14,000 to 15,000 of those are Hamas militants. That leaves the vast majority who are innocent civilians. According to Oxfam, more Palestinians are dying every day in Gaza than in any other major conflict of recent years. Those that have survived have been largely starved of food, water, medicines, and fuel. 1.7 million Gazans have been displaced, creating a massive humanitarian disaster of its own. Only 12 of 36 hospitals are partially functioning, and of course, starvation has become an additional threat to the population. I fully acknowledge Israel's right to self-defense, and I sympathize with the trauma and the suffering of the survivors and their families. Over 100,000 Israelis have been evacuated from their homes, both along the Gaza Strip and in northern communities along the Lebanese border. It's also clear that fighting inside Gaza, a densely populated, built-up urban area where Hamas does intentionally use the civilian population as human shields and does use hospitals and schools as safe havens for its fighters, often leaves Israel between a rock and a hard place. But whatever Israel's rights and fears are, these do not, in my view, justify the siege and collective punishment that Israel initially imposed, nor the trickle of humanitarian supplies that it is permitted to enter Gaza for most of the past 8.5 months. Clearly, Israel, not unlike other militaries, has chosen to minimize the casualties of its own forces, almost irrespective of the deaths and injuries its operations are causing. The IDF has acknowledged the obvious, that it is operating with looser rules of engagement. A visiting American senator called the Israeli inspection process for humanitarian assistance as arbitrary and said that Israel was failing to deliver on two of the Biden administration's key demands: increase humanitarian assistance, reduce the number of civilian deaths. In both cases, the situation had briefly improved in the months just before Israel moved into Rafah, but humanitarian assistance has now come to a standstill again. As importantly, the Israeli Prime Minister continues until today to reject all calls both for an eventual Palestinian Authority-led government in Gaza and for a credible pathway towards a Palestinian state. At a very minimum, a second humanitarian ceasefire should have been and should be agreed, one that would allow for the delivery of water, food, medicines, and other aid. Israel can't order 1.3 million Palestinians to move to the south and continue its attacks. It should have realized that its actions will further radicalize Palestinians in Gaza and in the West Bank, and should also understand that eliminating an ideology is far more difficult than killing all of Hamas's leaders and destroying its infrastructure. And Israel should understand by now that its bombing campaign and the massive death toll has in some ways allowed Hamas to declare a moral victory and paint Israel as a pariah globally. Finally, Israel should have immediately rejected statements by some ministers to rid Palestinians of Gaza and the West Bank, and to replace them with settlers, or to suggest, as some did, that all Gazans were responsible for Hamas's actions on October 7. Indeed, it was precisely these statements and others that led in part to Israel ending up before the International Court of Justice on charges of genocide. And it was the siege and other restrictions on humanitarian assistance and the indiscriminate bombing that resulted in the applications to arrest Bibi Netanyahu and his Minister of Defense by the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. Obviously, October 7 and the war have broader consequences. Hezbollah continues to attack northern Israel, causing concerns right now about a second, far more dangerous front opening up. The Houthis from Yemen are preventing 65% of international shipping from using the Suez Canal. And of course, Israel and Iran recently engaged in a very dangerous tit-for-tat. And Joe Biden's bid for the presidency could be hurt by his ongoing support for Israel. In the West, more generally, the impact has been to polarize our communities in ways we have rarely seen. Christian clerics, imams, and rabbis have been unable to join hands to condemn actions on both sides. Some of the opponents of the war are afraid to publicly criticize it for being labeled anti-Semitic. Jewish students are being attacked on some campuses, synagogues are being shot at, and families are split over what is a just defense and what is a war crime. In Toronto and on campuses across North America and Europe, protests and encampments run the gamut from anti-war demonstrations to anti-occupation protests and to support for a one-state solution, all legitimate views. But they also run to calls for the elimination of the Jewish state, outright anti-Semitism, and physical threats, which should be condemned. It is, of course, always the most extreme and the most hateful manifestations of protest that garner the bulk of the media attention. And these protests have caused no end of difficulty for university presidents, for faculty members, for students, and for the parents of students. Some protesters mouth slogans such as Palestine from the river to the sea, or Jews go back to Poland, without fully understanding what they mean or how they are received. As I mentioned, many have little understanding of the complex history of the conflict or of the competing and compelling narratives of these two people who justly characterize themselves as victims. We must be reminded and remind others that all Palestinians are not terrorists, and all Muslims are not anti-Semitic, that all Jews don't support Israel, that many oppose the war and the occupation, and that Islamophobia and anti-Semitism are equally abhorrent. It should be possible to condemn Hamas for October 7 and for what they have wreaked on their own people since, and at the same time to acknowledge that Israel may be fighting a just war unjustly. The occupation, the threats of annexation, and the failure of Israel for 16 years to even contemplate a horizon for peace don't justify the horrific attacks against peaceful civilians that took place on October 7. Indeed, as some of you may know and have heard, many of those killed on the kibbutzim next to Gaza had been at the forefront of the peace movement in Israel for years prior to the attack. But Israel's past and ongoing treatment of Palestinians do help explain why it quickly loses the sympathy of so many countries, the media, and the younger generation when its legitimate right to self-defense leads to the death and the destruction we are witnessing today. The failure to address the occupation, Bibi's covert support for Hamas, the denigration of the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, despite its effort to protect Israelis, and the day-to-day treatment of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza all mean that Israel doesn't come to the table with particularly clean hands. Context and root causes cannot justify terror against innocent civilians, but they, Israel's insensitive advocacy and its bravado, do help explain why sympathy and understanding for Israel's situation is often short-lived. So what next? It's now past time to end this war, secure the release of the surviving hostages, and implement a plan for the day after, which will require Israel to fully exit Gaza, impose a multinational force to guarantee calm and security there, provide billions of dollars, and I mean billions of dollars, for the immediate rebuilding of homes, hospitals, schools, and infrastructure, and eventually impose a Palestinian body to govern both the West Bank and Gaza. This will take years. In Israel, little positive will happen until Bibi Netanyahu is removed, either by protest or by the ballot. There are growing signs that his coalition may be splitting at the seams, but he is a master politician. Similarly, in the West Bank, Mahmoud Abbas, corrupt, deeply unpopular, and 88 years old, also must go. A revitalized Palestinian Authority must support free and fair elections and hope that a moderate group of young leaders will engage in the process. Palestinians are the best educated of all Arabs in the Middle East. There are many young Palestinians who are more than capable of taking the reins and building a Palestinian state. Despite this difficult story, some real glimmers of hope exist going forward. I know that's what you're all waiting for. One is the notion, as I said, of two states that is very much back on the international agenda. Despite the Netanyahu government's rejection of it, Joe Biden, Justin Trudeau, all EU leaders, former Israeli prime ministers Ehud Barak and Ehud Olmert, and hundreds of ex-Israeli generals and former heads of the Israeli intelligence and internal security organizations are all saying that now is the time to give this option a chance again. We shouldn't expect either Palestinians or Israelis to embrace two states today or next week. Emotions are far too raw and the fear far too overwhelming. But I hope and I believe it is possible that Israelis and Palestinians will, after the pain and the trauma has eased, finally realize that a permanent separation is a far better solution than a continuing occupation, and that without some agreement between the 7.5 million Jews and the 7.5 million Arabs who occupy this tiny region, that violence will inevitably erupt again. Neither of those two groups are going away. 4 years after the 1973 Yom Kippur War, Anwar Sadat spoke in Israel's parliament. 2 years later, Israel and Egypt signed a historic peace treaty. The historic handshake between Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat on the White House lawn that led to the Oslo Accords took place after the First Intifada. No one believed that apartheid would end in South Africa when it did. I met a South African journalist in Israel when I was there who was forced to leave South Africa, and he told me that he thought apartheid would last at least another 50 years. No one believed that the Berlin Wall would fall when it did. I was on the executive floor of the Department of Foreign Affairs when our ambassador from Moscow came to brief us 6 months before the Berlin Wall fell. He didn't have a clue, and nobody in the State Department and nobody in Moscow had a clue that the Berlin Wall would fall and communism would be over. And no one thought that Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland could make peace after 400 years of fighting. So I continue to believe that 2 states for 2 peoples is the only solution. The issues to be resolved are all well known, and they can be achieved. But it will take strong leadership, compromise from both sides, the strength to withstand extremists like these right-wing radical ministers in Bibi's government and extremists like Hamas. I hope that the horrific crisis that we are witnessing today may be the impetus for wiser men and women in Palestine and in Israel to finally realize this. My second reason for hope is the activities of a variety of civil society organizations that are continuing to build trust and respect between Palestinians and Israelis despite the ongoing conflict. I chair one of those organizations. It's called Rosanna Canada. It's a nonprofit with affiliates in the US and Australia, the UK, and of course in Israel, and we're just setting up an office in Ramallah. It was created when a bunch of us realized that we weren't going to be able to create peace, to change the political situation on the ground in the immediate, but we could use health as a vector to bring Israelis and Palestinians together in an atmosphere of mutual trust and respect. So what do? We build up Palestinian health capacity by funding the joint training of Palestinian doctors, nurses, and other health professionals. 250 Palestinian nurses and 250 Israeli nurses are being trained together. The Israelis are learning Arabic, the Palestinians are learning Hebrew, and they're taking courses in conflict resolution and resilience. We equip Palestinian medical teams with Israeli technologies. A gynecologist, a Palestinian doctor, gynecologist, dentist, nurses go into remote villages in the West Bank, and they use Israeli technologies to treat women and children that have never been treated before. We transport Palestinian patients, mostly women and children, from the checkpoints to Israeli hospitals. 100,000 Palestinians are treated in Israeli hospitals every year. We do our part by transporting them when we can. And we train Israeli and Palestinians in PTSD in children, and our graduates are using their training right now in various hospitals. We're often asked if we've been able to carry out our work despite the war, and the answer is absolutely. Every one of our projects, except the transportation from Gaza, because no one's leaving Gaza, is operating. Needless to say, when the conflict ends, our services will be in even higher demand. So, if you're feeling some despair and some helplessness in the face of events in the region, I can offer you 2 possible outlets. First of all, support ending the war, releasing the hostages, and the push to a 2-state solution by writing your MP, by writing the Minister of Foreign Affairs and the Prime Minister. Tell them to tell Israel to stop the settlements now and to create a credible path forward for peace with 2 states as the end point, and encourage them to support and to fund political change and moderation in the West Bank and in Gaza. And second, if you want to make a difference today, you can donate to Rosanna or any number of other nonprofits that operate in the region. There's three others listed on the paper that's with you, and you're going to be getting a message from the church which will list 4 others. So you'll have 7 places to donate to if you want to help civil society bring peace, mutual respect in the region. Peace is possible, and we can help make it. So thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you for those highly instructive words, delivered with sober clarity, full of wise opinions. I will have an opportunity to thank you even more afterwards, but now I invite David to come up. Thank you for coming up, and for you who have questions, to pass them to the center aisle. Paul and Tony are collecting questions, and they will be delivered to David, who will glance at them and articulate them for you. While that's happening, David has some questions of his own to ask of Jon.
Jon, thank you again for such a nuanced and informative talk. One of the things that I'm aware of in current responses in Canada is that often horror at what's going on now in Gaza has, to a significant extent in the discourse, erased attention to what happened on October 7th itself. So here's a question. I can imagine people saying that a disproportionate response in support of the people of Gaza, ignoring what happened because of Hamas's attack on October 7th, and ignoring Hamas's horrific exploitation of the Palestinian population in Gaza, that disproportionate response could be seen as a kind of dog whistle of anti-Semitism. Somebody with that attitude might say, why are you talking only about what the IDF is doing now? Why are you not talking with equal moral outrage and an equal call for justice against what Hamas has done? For that matter, why are you not talking about what's going on in Sudan, what's going on in Myanmar? Is that disproportionate support of the Gazan cause a kind of dog whistle for anti-Semitic feeling?
It's a tough question. For years, Israelis and the diaspora has argued that there are more resolutions criticizing Israel in the United Nations, about 14 a year now, than any other country. Syria, Myanmar, you mentioned, China, Russia, but Israel tends to get singled out. So I think there does tend to be, first of all, a focus on the Middle East, unlike any other region. There are hundreds of thousands of people starving in Africa, we know now, in Sudan, in other parts of Africa. War continues, but the focus always tends to come back to the Middle East. So That's one thing. There is an inevitable media focus, in part because it's Israel, and there is a focus, certainly in the U.S., to a lesser extent in Canada, on Israel being the major ally of the U.S. in the region, etc. It used to be because of oil. It's clearly because there's a potential for Iran and Israel and others to engage in a much larger set of conflicts. So that kind of explains it. Going to your question, Israel is a democracy, and it should not be necessarily subjected to more criticism than others, but it is a democracy. It wants to be a part of the West, and it must abide by international humanitarian law. Hamas deserves to be criticized. Applications for the arrest of the 3 Hamas leaders have already been issued as well. But Hamas is a terrorist organization. We can say all we want about a terrorist organization, and they're not necessarily going to listen. We expect, whether it's the United States in Afghanistan or in Iraq, or whether it's Israel here, to abide by international humanitarian law. We came out of the Second World War after cities were bombed, and innocents were killed, and prisoners were assassinated, with a set of rules to try and govern the way wars are fought. And I think essentially that is what is being asked in some cases. In other cases, the connection between Jews in the diaspora and the Jewish state, Israel is the Jewish state, gets mixed up. And therefore you get people that are blatantly anti-Semitic, who not only attack Jews in the diaspora, but attack Israel and are prepared to see it wiped out. That has to be condemned, should be condemned. But at the same time, legitimate criticism of Israel's actions, people that I don't support a one-state solution. I think it would be a disaster. But if people support a one-state solution, that's not necessarily anti-Semitism. That's a political view. And so I just think that we have to be careful. Your point is well taken, but we can't stifle free speech. We have to separate free speech, legitimate criticism, from hate speech, anti-Semitism, etc.
Thank you. We do have questions from the audience, not at all surprisingly. And one of those is whether outside of the current Israeli government, the current governing coalition, are there enough politicians, political actors, political voices in Israel who are now advocating for a two-state solution that is likely to be a viable consideration with the fall of this government? Is the political infrastructure there within Israel to move forward with that project?
Yeah, I think any politician would be very wary of, strongly advocating two states, peace right now. The emotions, as I said, are incredibly raw. The support for a two-state solution has dropped from 50% down to 26% in Israel. I'm not sure what the exact figures are in the West Bank, but certainly support for Hamas has gone up in the West Bank. So the time is not propitious generally. But going to your specific point, you've got a radical right-wing coalition right now. Benny Gantz, who just left the War Cabinet, was the leader of the opposition and for a while was thought to be the man that, if elections were had, would become the next prime minister, has lost a bit of his luster. And if I were to predict, I would say that you might get he's center, although center in Israel post-October 7 has moved sort of to the right. But I would suggest that people like Naftali Bennett and Gideon Sa'ar and a few others who were in the previous coalition may well take the reins. They would form a coalition with Benny Gantz, with a guy named Yair Lapid. The left is finally coming back together. Hopefully Arab-Israeli parties, whom I said form 20% of the population, they will hopefully all come together in an anti-Bibi coalition. There will not be a push for two states right now. Yair Lapid is the one politician who's had the guts to say that if and when the Palestinians get their act together, then I'm prepared to sit down with them. And as I said, Ehud Barak, Ehud Olmert, former prime ministers, not lefties by any stretch of the imagination, have all come to that conclusion. So it will take time. The West, we, Canada, Europe, the United States, we have mouthed the two-state solution for 2 decades, but we've done nothing to move it forward. We've allowed the settlements to be built, to increase, to go from 250,000 at the time of Oslo to almost 700,000 now. So the West has to keep putting the pressure on. It has to sanction settlers who are violent. There's a lot of things the West could do to move this along. And as I say, it really is the only solution, and the light will go on at some point.
Thank you. We'll never get through all the questions, but another was the question of how well Ottawa actually understands current dynamics in Israel, and what explains what the questioner characterizes as Ottawa's weak response and failure to refer to international law in the way the Canadian government is responding to the war.
So, this, it's not 100% clear, because this question could be coming from both sides. It could be the Jewish diaspora saying, why are they doing so much to promote a ceasefire? Or it could be, but I'm taking it this is the other side. They're saying, why isn't Canada being more strict in its adherence to the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice? I was very disappointed in the government's response on the International Criminal Court. We, as a country, were amongst the strongest supporters of the International Criminal Court. It is a totally independent court. The fact that the court announced applications for arrest of both Israelis and Hamas at the same time was argued as being somehow morally equivalent. There was no sense of moral equivalence just because they were announced at the same time. There was a sense that there was a breach of international humanitarian law on both sides. On Hamas' side, it was pretty evident what it was. It was the mutilation, the rape, the hostage-taking, etc., etc. On the Israeli side, for 2 weeks, they imposed a siege. Using food as a weapon of war is a breach of international law. And it was pretty obvious. But Canada, instead of saying independent prosecutor, independent court, we'll see what happens, they were a bit wishy-washy on it. And on the International Court of Justice and the genocide case, which is only a case, by the way, there's been no proof of genocide by Israel, and I doubt highly that Israel will be found to have been committing genocide. They definitely, you can argue, have committed crimes against humanity, but genocide's a different story. On that one, they just basically acknowledged it. They didn't get involved in it. Why? The government's criticized on both sides. It's not doing enough. It's doing too much. The vote in my riding, in which the Conservatives won, some of the analysis says that parts of it are Jewish riding, and the Jews were very unhappy with the way the Trudeau government supported a ceasefire and renewed funding for UNRWA. And so, there's pressures on both sides. I've actually been relatively impressed with the Canadian government. They have called for a ceasefire. They did renew funding for UNRWA, which, for all its criticism, is the only organization on the ground, a UN organization that's delivering aid. So, tough situation to be in. I wouldn't want to be the Israeli ambassador, the Canadian ambassador in Israel right now.
Congratulations on your retirement from that position. Jon, this is probably the last question we have time for. It seems to me a particularly important one moving forward. You talked about the enormous size of the investment that will be necessary in order to rebuild Gaza. How might the reconstruction of Gaza be organized, and how might it be funded? Do you see a particular scenario that you think is most plausible?
Well, first of all, Israel has to get out. It can't remain in, and it can't remain just outside, ready to come in at any time. Nobody, the IMF, the World Bank, the Gulf states, the West, will not come in unless Israel leaves. And then, before any reconstruction, even major humanitarian assistance is going to be able to get in, somebody is going to have to grab control of the security situation. Otherwise, you could have a Somalia. So somebody has to be able to assure that the Strip is secure and that any insurgencies are taken care of. And once that happens, and hopefully that will be a combination of Gulf state, NATO, Western, nobody quite knows what the combination will be and which countries will step up, but hopefully they will. And then the money, which we're talking billions, will again hopefully come from the Gulf and also from the West, and managed through the international financial organizations and the various aid organizations. It will definitely take time. but it could be, the beginning of something very new and very different there. And especially if we could see elections in the Palestinian Authority, again, over time, not going to happen tomorrow, but if you can get legitimate elections there and get the governance in the West Bank beefed up, and eventually they or some Palestinian entity would hopefully govern. The best Palestinian leader that they've ever had is a guy named Salam Fayyad, who was a professor, was at the IMF. He became the finance minister and then the prime minister. He was not corrupt. He was efficient. He managed an extremely good government. He keeps talking about, you're going to need all Palestinian factions, probably including a non-militarized Hamas. But whatever, we just have to hope. And we'll see. Ojalá, as they say.
Ojalá.
Ojalá.
There are more questions. We could talk for a long time. Perhaps there will be a little bit of informal conversation afterwards, but we'll draw the formal question period to a close. Thank you again so much, and Anne will come back.
Before I conclude our evening with the prayer, I want to thank some of those who have made this evening possible, to our audio technician, Morgan, to the staff at Church of the Redeemer, to you in the audience, both online and those of you who came out tonight, and to David for his interlocutory skills. But most especially on all of our behalfs, I want to thank you, Jon. That was really a remarkable set of words, full of wisdom and insight, knowledge, intimate knowledge, and clarity, as I said earlier. And thank you for pointing us towards hope and action. Thank you so much. And now I ask those of you who wish to join me in prayer. God, you who are love, for whom each human being is beloved, inspire us to see all your children through your loving heart. God, you who are justice, for whom justice and goodness are paramount, enable us to find your ways to encourage and establish justice among the peoples of Israel and Palestine and all the peoples of the earth. God, you who are peace, who desires harmony and health for all your creation, teach us to find your peace in our hearts and to make peace in your world. Amen. I wish you all a very good evening.